The last glance into the void. In the heart of an ancient forest, where even sunlight seemed to be a prisoner of darkness, stood a house. Legends swirled about it, those who entered never returned. The source of terror was a window on the second floor, an enormous stained glass pane of black glass. The legend said it was a boundary between the world of the living and something far older. But Daria knew nothing of this. She came to the village seeking peace and quiet, unaware that she was about to encounter something lurking beyond the edges of reality. The house was in a state of decay, creaking floors, sagging walls, cobwebs in every corner. Yet, Daria resolved to restore it. Her first night was spent on the ground floor, in a small room near the fireplace. That night was restless. She woke with an eerie feeling, as if someone was watching her. Glancing around, she saw only shadows cast by the flickering fire. But in the darkest hours, she heard a whisper. "You've come." By morning, she dismissed it as exhaustion. Yet, with each passing day, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. On the third day, Daria decided to venture upstairs to the second floor, where the infamous black window was located. As soon as she entered the room, a strange sensation gripped her. Someone was watching her. The stained glass was unusual, its surface seemed less like glass and more like something alive. When Daria moved closer, she thought she saw a shadow flicker beyond the pane. But there was nothing behind it, only the dense forest. Daria began to discover odd things. In one attic cupboard, she found diaries belonging to the house's previous occupants. One of them read, "The stained glass is not a window. It's a gate. If you stare into it too long, you'll see them. But the worst part is, they'll see you." In another journal, she read even stranger words. "I saw her. She stared at me from the depths of the glass. Her face became mine, and now I no longer know who I am." Daria dismissed these as delusions. But that night, she heard the whisper again. At dawn, she decided to conduct an experiment. She placed a mirror opposite the stained glass to see what might be reflected within its depths. As soon as the mirror was turned, silhouettes began to take shape in the reflection. They weren't trees or the forest. They were faces, distorted, inhuman. They seemed to push toward the surface of the glass, desperate to break free. Suddenly, Daria saw herself in the reflection. But her face was twisted, her eyes black. Her reflection spoke. "Why did you open us? Now we will always be with you." Terrified, Daria threw the mirror to the floor, shattering it. Her reflection disappeared, but the stained glass began to vibrate. Long, black shadows poured out of it, filling the room. Daria tried to escape, but when she reached the door, the shadows wrapped around her wrists. At the last moment, she managed to break free and ran out of the house without looking back. She sought refuge in the village, recounting everything to the locals. They listened in silence until an old woman finally spoke. "If you saw your reflection in the stained glass, it's over. It will hunt you until it takes you." That night, even in the village elder's home, Daria heard the whisper again. She locked every door and window, but it was futile. At midnight, she saw the figure from the stained glass in the corner of the room, her distorted double. The creature smiled, its lips mouthing, "The house is waiting for you." At dawn, the villagers found her bed empty. The only trace left behind was a handprint on the windowpane. Since then, the house became even more ominous. Anyone passing by could see the silhouette of a woman in the stained glass. Sometimes it moved, sometimes it simply stared. But one thing never changed: if you stared into that window for too long, you'd see your own reflection. And it would be the last glance you ever cast at the world of the living. The villagers avoided speaking about the house, but one day, the old woman who had spoken with Daria decided to reveal the true story. "That house was built by a man," she began, staring into the fire. "His name was Stepan Gromov. He was a master glassmaker. They say he could create stained glass so beautiful it seemed alive in the sunlight. But one day, he wanted to create something more. The old woman sighed heavily, her hands trembling as she continued. Stepan made a stained glass window that was not just glass. He performed some kind of ritual to connect it to the world of shadows. Why? No one knows. But they say he wanted to see his deceased wife. Only, instead of her, something else came to him. The villagers found Stepan dead not long after, and they locked the house up. Ever since, anyone who looked into that window disappeared. Daria knew she had nowhere left to run. The creature from the stained glass wouldn't release her. It appeared in her dreams, in the reflections of puddles, even in the dark corners of rooms. She realized she had to return to the house and end the nightmare. Daria resolved to do whatever it took to destroy the stained glass. She armed herself with a hammer and an old axe borrowed from a local woodcutter. The return to the house was agonizing. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in her mind, like malicious laughter. When she reached the stained glass, fear engulfed her. The window was no longer still. The glass pulsed like living tissue, and silhouettes emerged once again on its surface. Among them was her own distorted face. Daria raised the hammer and struck with all her might. The scream that erupted in that moment was inhuman. The glass didn't shatter, it tore open like a wound. From it emerged long, dark arms that wrapped around her body and began to drag her inside. Daria screamed, clawing at the floor, but the shadows were stronger. Her face drew closer to the stained glass, and in the final moment, she saw her reflection. It was smiling, coldly, darkly, without a trace of compassion. With a deafening slam, the glass sealed itself shut. The house fell silent once more. Weeks later, a new family arrived in the village, a young couple with a child. They were warned to stay away from the house, but they only laughed it off. On the very first night, the little girl woke up and went to the window. In the depths of the forest, she saw a light, a flickering glow that beckoned her. It led her to the house. Up to the second floor. To the stained glass. And there, in the glass, a woman with long black hair and empty eyes greeted her. The woman whispered. "Welcome." A little girl, Lisa, stood in front of the stained glass, staring mesmerized into its depths. Her parents, Alexei and Marina, slept peacefully downstairs, unaware that their daughter had left her room. "Do you want to see magic?" A soft voice echoed from the window. Lisa nodded. Images began to form in the glass, blooming gardens, castles of light, and fantastical creatures. They beckoned her closer. But the longer she watched, the more the scenes distorted. The gardens withered, the castles crumbled, and the creatures transformed into dark figures with hollow eyes. Lisa screamed, and her parents woke up. Marina rushed into the room on the second floor. Lisa was standing right in front of the stained glass, her eyes vacant, as if life had drained from her body. Marina grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, but Lisa suddenly turned and whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. "You've brought us." Marina froze, paralyzed by icy fear. She glanced at the stained glass and saw Daria, the very woman who had disappeared weeks ago. But her face was warped, as if pieced together from shards of broken glass. Alexei ran into the room, holding a hammer. He struck the stained glass with all his strength, but just like with Daria, the glass didn't shatter. Instead, dark hands emerged from within and grabbed him by the neck. He screamed, but in seconds his body was pulled inside the glass. Left alone with her daughter, Marina tried to get Lisa out of the house, but the doors wouldn't budge. Lisa suddenly spoke again, her voice no longer her own. "This house is their gateway. The window is just the beginning. They will come for everyone." "Who are they?" Marina cried, tears streaming down her face. "They are the ones who lived here long before us. Those cast aside by the light. They need souls to regain their strength. Marina realized she couldn't save her daughter without dealing with the stained glass. She needed to find a way to destroy it. Marina found an old diary in the house's library. It was the very book where Stepan Gromov had described creating the stained glass. In the final entry, he had written, "The window cannot be broken, but it can be sealed. To close the gateway, a sacrifice is needed, one whose soul is already bound to the shadow. Only they can end this forever." Marina understood that this referred to Daria. She looked at the stained glass, and the woman inside smiled again. "You know what must be done," the distorted face said. Gathering all her courage, Marina took Lisa's hand and approached the stained glass. Daria stared at her from within. Suddenly, shadows began pouring out, filling the room. "You cannot save them," the voice from the glass declared. "The shadows belong to this world." But Marina remembered the words from the diary. She shouted, "Daria, you opened the gateway. Now close it." Daria froze, her warped face twisting even further. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and spoke in a quiet but firm voice. "I'm tired." The shadows shrieked. The room began to tremble, and cracks spread across the glass. In a final moment, Daria's face disappeared, and the glass shattered, releasing a blinding light. The house fell silent once more. Marina and Lisa stepped outside into the cold dawn. Lisa was weak, but life had returned to her eyes. The next day, the house was gone, as if it had never existed. Yet the villagers still say that deep in the forest, a faint glow sometimes appears, shaped like a window. And they say that if you get too close, you'll hear a whisper. "Look at me." Rain lashed against the windows of the old boarding house, hidden deep in the forest. The sky was pitch black, as if someone had erased all the stars. In the distance, thunder rumbled dully, as if warning that it was better to stay home tonight. But Anna was already standing on the doorstep, holding a massive iron key covered in rust. The key was the only thing she had found in a sealed envelope delivered to her on the day of her Uncle Victor's death. The letter read, "Anna, if you're reading this, it means my time has come. You must return to where it all began. The gravestone boarding house awaits you. Accept it. But remember, do not stay there past midnight. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, leave. They do not forgive mistakes." Anna clutched the letter in her hand and stepped over the creaky threshold. As soon as the door closed behind her, a strange tension hung in the air. The beam of her flashlight illuminated a dilapidated hallway with peeling wallpaper and cobwebs in the corners. "It's just an old house," she tried to convince herself, but something deep within the boarding house seemed to stir, whisper, and reach for her from the darkness. She climbed to the second floor, where the guest rooms were located. All the doors were closed except for one. Anna peeked inside. The room was surprisingly tidy, a clean bed, neatly drawn curtains, and even a small candle on the bedside table. On the desk stood a tea set. But the strangest thing of all was that the teacup in front of her was half filled with still warm tea. "Who's there?" Anna asked, her voice trembling as it echoed through the empty building. There was no answer, but suddenly she heard a quiet, barely audible whisper. "You've come." Anna froze, unable to tear her gaze away from the stained glass window. Her reflection slowly tilted its head to the side, even though she herself remained motionless. Her heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might burst from her chest. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice breaking and filling the room with fear. The reflection suddenly smiled. Anna's lips quivered, but her own face did not move. Then, the glass cracked like a spiderweb, and a low, vibrating whisper emanated from it. "Do you see? She's watching." The wardrobe began to tremble, and thick black liquid seeped through the cracks in the glass. Anna staggered back, nearly falling, but her legs were rooted to the floor in terror. The liquid oozed downward, spreading across the floor and leaving behind a sticky, sinister trail. At that moment, the light in the study went out. Only the weak beam of her flashlight lit distorted details, the ink pooling on the floor, torn diary pages, and the wardrobe, now inexplicably empty. But the darkness surrounding her was not ordinary, it seemed to move, breathe, and whisper. "You must leave," a raspy voice sounded behind her. Anna turned around. Standing in the doorway of the study was a tall, elongated figure. Its face was hidden by a hood, and its arms were unnaturally long and thin, with crooked fingers resembling the roots of an old tree. "Who are you?" Anna managed to choke out, barely breathing. The figure did not reply. Instead, it raised one of its thin hands and pointed at something behind Anna. She turned her head slowly and saw that the wardrobe had once again filled with strange darkness. Only now, hands were reaching out of it. Black, eyeless hands clawed their way out, gripping the edges of the wardrobe. They seemed to search for something, ready to grab anyone who ventured too close. Anna screamed, spun around, and ran out of the study. Her legs carried her through corridors that seemed to grow longer and darker. The boarding house, once old and decrepit, now felt alive. The walls breathed, the floorboards creaked, and strange whispers and children's laughter echoed behind closed doors. Anna burst into the large living room, where a long-extinguished fireplace stood at the center. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, trying to calm herself. Her attention was drawn to a large mirror hanging above the fireplace. It was perfectly clean, as if someone had just polished it. Anna stood and approached it. At first glance, everything appeared normal, her reflection was there. But as she stared, she realized the room behind her in the mirror looked different. In the reflection, the walls were not decayed, and the fireplace blazed with bright flames. Anna turned around, but the room behind her remained cold and ruined. Suddenly, her reflection stopped moving. Anna froze. Her breathing quickened as she watched her reflection slowly raise a finger to its lips, gesturing for silence. "What are you?" she began, but didn't finish. A hand suddenly shot out of the mirror, grabbing her by the throat and pulling her in. She screamed, but her voice seemed to vanish. Her body was halfway through the glass. On the other side, it was cold and dark, and shadows moved behind her reflection, as if waiting to pounce. She struggled, fighting with all her might to break free, but dark hands began clutching at her shoulders, dragging her deeper. At the last moment, Anna braced her foot against the mirror's frame, and the glass shattered. A horrible screech echoed from within, and the mirror's surface suddenly spat her back out. She fell to the floor, gasping for air. The fireplace went dark. "Leave," rasped a voice directly in front of her. Anna looked up and saw a woman in an antique dress. Her skin was pale, and her eyes burned with emptiness. "You must finish what Victor started," the woman said, pointing toward the staircase that led to the basement. Anna didn't want to go down. Everything in this place screamed danger, warning her that she might never come back. But the voice of the woman from the mirror echoed in her mind, "Finish what Victor started." She aimed her flashlight at the staircase leading to the basement and noticed fresh marks on the steps, long prints, like bare feet covered in mud. Each step downward reverberated with a hollow echo. The air grew colder, and the damp smell mixed with something metallic, making her nauseous. The basement walls were crumbling, etched with strange symbols carved by something sharp. At the end of the corridor, her flashlight illuminated a massive iron door. It looked as though it wasn't made to protect from intruders but to keep something locked inside. "Don't do this," whispered a voice behind her. Anna spun around, but no one was there. She turned back to the door. A plaque was affixed to it, engraved with the words, "Sealed until the truth is revealed." Her hands trembled as she reached for the rusty lock. The key she had found in her uncle's envelope fit perfectly. There was a loud click, and the door creaked open. Beyond it was a room. In the center stood a circular stone table surrounded by candles, long extinguished, leaving thick trails of wax on the surface. On the floor, a strange symbol had been carved, a circle entwined with intricate lines and unknown markings. On the table lay a large book with a leather cover. Its pages were cracked with age, and the edges were scorched. Golden letters on the cover read, Liber Umbri, the Book of Shadows. Anna stepped closer and touched the cover. The moment she did, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, though there were no windows. The candles on the floor flared to life, casting an eerie orange glow. The book opened on its own. Words began to appear on its pages, written in dark ink, as if someone was writing them before her very eyes. Whoever opens this book will set her free. You've made your choice, Anna. Now the boarding house belongs to her. As soon as she finished reading, the air around her thickened. Figures began to emerge from the shadows on the walls. At first, there were 2, then 5, then dozens. They were shapeless, but their eyes glowed with a deathly white light. Anna stepped back, but the figures advanced. They whispered. You've brought her. She's coming back. Anna realized the boarding house had never been an ordinary place. It was a trap created by her uncle to contain some ancient evil. And now, she had unleashed it. The shadows surrounded her, their cold hands reaching for her face. In a last desperate act, Anna grabbed the book and threw it into the flames of the candles. The room shook violently. The shadows screamed as the glowing circle on the floor began to absorb them, one by one. Anna closed her eyes, feeling everything collapse around her. When she opened them again, she was back at the entrance to the boarding house. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clear. The door behind her slammed shut on its own, and the sound of the lock snapping back into place brought her back to reality. Anna looked at the house and whispered, I'm never coming back here. But at that moment, she noticed her reflection in a small puddle of rainwater by her feet. It smiled back at her. Anna stepped back from the puddle but couldn't tear her eyes away from her reflection. It continued to stare at her, its smile growing wider, distorting the features of her face. At one point, the eyes in the reflection darkened, turning into 2 black voids. This can't be real, Anna whispered, but her voice trembled, as if she didn't believe her own words. She spun around quickly, trying not to look down, and hurried toward her car, which was parked on the road in front of the boarding house. But the farther she got from the building, the more it seemed that the darkness was following her. Once inside the car, Anna turned the ignition key. The engine started, but the strange feeling still lingered. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The boarding house was gone. In its place were only dense trees, twisting together, as if the building had never existed. She slowly drove onto the road, but soon she noticed that the path she had come on looked entirely different. The trees seemed to close in above her, forming a dense canopy that blocked out any light. The headlights could barely penetrate the thick darkness. The clock on the dashboard showed 11:57. Anna remembered the warning from the letter, not to stay after midnight. It's just a road, she whispered to herself, gripping the wheel so tightly her fingers turned white. I'll get out of here, and it'll all be over. But her heart began to beat faster when she saw something ahead. A figure stood by the side of the road. It didn't move, but its outline was familiar, tall, with long arms, like the roots of a tree. Anna swerved the wheel sharply, trying to avoid this thing, but as she passed by, the figure vanished. A second later, it reappeared in the headlights, now right in the middle of the road. The car screeched to a halt. Anna squeezed her eyes shut, but there was no impact. When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. She accelerated again, but the road became increasingly strange. It seemed to loop in circles, same trees, same bends. Soon, Anna realized she had been driving in a closed loop this entire time. The clock struck midnight. As soon as the hands reached this mark, the car's engine died. Only the faint glow of the headlights continued to illuminate the road. Anna tried to restart the car, but it was useless. In the complete silence, she heard footsteps. Slow, measured, they were approaching from the forest. No, no, not this, she exhaled, looking at the rearview mirror. Behind her, in the headlights, figures appeared, many elongated, faceless shadows. There were dozens of them. They stood still, as if waiting for her reaction. With trembling hands, Anna grabbed her phone, but the signal was gone. In a panic, she left the car and ran into the forest, not looking back. Branches tore at her clothes, scratched her face, but she didn't stop. Her only thought was to get far away from the road, from the boarding house, from those shadows. Suddenly, she spotted a faint light ahead. It was an old cabin, covered with moss and branches. A refuge. Anna rushed inside and slammed the door behind her. There was only one chair, an old table, and a dim lantern flickering, barely illuminating the room. "Help! Anyone!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. She pressed herself against the door, hearing footsteps outside. The shadows were near. They surrounded the cabin, and their voices grew louder. "You've brought her. Now you will stay." Anna took a step back, but suddenly something cold touched her shoulder. She spun around and saw the woman in the old dress. "I warned you," she said, her eyes glowing with a grim light. "But now it's too late." The cabin disappeared, as if it had never existed. Anna was back in the forest, surrounded by the shadows. In their deathly glowing eyes, the boarding house reflected, once again appearing behind her, as if beckoning her back. Anna stood in the center of the same forest, in the same spot where it all began. The shadows merged together, forming a solid monolith of darkness, but now they were no longer empty figures, they were a part of her own nightmare. The boarding house, which had once seemed abandoned, was now back in its place, as if it had never left for even a moment. Despair overwhelmed her. She realized she couldn't escape this closed loop. The boarding house was once again before her, with its gloom and ominous shadows, which seemed to be part of something older and more powerful. She tried to move, but her steps didn't take her any farther. Every movement of her body was slow, as if by inertia, as if she had ceased to be a living being. But suddenly, seemingly by the will of dark forces, she found herself in front of the house again. The doors opened, as if they had been waiting for her. She slowly entered. The staircase leading to the dark corridors felt familiar, as if she had returned here hundreds of times. The sinister sounds emanating from the depths of the boarding house grew tighter around her soul. None of this was real, yet it was a reality she couldn't change. On the top floor, in the very room where she first saw the mirror, stood a figure. It was herself, but her eyes were now as black as the abyss, and there was neither fear nor pain in them. Only emptiness. Anna approached the mirror, and her reflection lifted its head, as if expecting this moment. "You're here again," her reflection spoke. "You can't leave. You freed her, and now she'll take you." Anna's hands began to shake. She understood that this wasn't just a game. Everything that had been happening was part of some ancient ritual. The boarding house was a trap, and she was the one who was supposed to bring the ritual to its end. "No, I can't," she whispered, trying to pull away from the mirror. But her reflection didn't move. It kept staring at her, and in its eyes burned a cold fire. Then, from the darkness of the boarding house, came the woman, the entity Anna had sensed from the very beginning. The dark woman in an old dress, whose eyes blazed with bright white light. "You freed me," the woman said. "You brought me here, Anna. Now you are mine." Anna felt her body growing weaker, her consciousness slipping into emptiness. She couldn't fight, she couldn't move. All that remained was to watch as her reflection in the mirror slowly merged with the shadow that filled everything around her. And in that moment, when her soul was ready to leave her body, Anna felt unimaginable pain. Pain that pierced her through, as if someone were tearing her very essence out. A single word emerged in her mind, and she realized it was her last chance. Victor. As if responding to her call, the room froze. Everything in the boarding house vanished in an instant, as if she had returned to the moment when she first entered the house. But now the boarding house was empty. It was old, ruined, without any power. Even the shadows disappeared, and around her there was nothing but lifeless cold. Anna stood in the center of the empty room. The flashlight's light flickered, and her body no longer felt pain. But her heart still beat in her chest, and she knew that this was the moment. She had won. The boarding house could no longer hold her. When she stepped beyond the threshold, the house was left behind, and her steps did not lead her back. Everything around her became bright and real. And, despite the lingering sensation of something dark in the depths of her being, she knew that now her freedom was real. The boarding house vanished. Somewhere on a street in the dark, forgotten part of the city, the old boarding house stood as it always had. But now it was empty and abandoned. Only the wind, whispering through its window frames, could remind anyone that people had once been here. The shadows that once filled it were gone, leaving only darkness, which was no longer as alive. But one day, when night swallows the city again, someone may find themselves in this place. And then the doors will open once more. And perhaps there will be a new person who opens that very book and unlocks the gates. But not everyone will have the chance to leave.